When we look at what is unfolding today, we have to be honest with ourselves. This is no longer a phase of quiet tension or distant hostility. For years, the relationship between Iran and Gulf states like the UAE has been defined by suspicion, proxy dynamics, and calculated diplomacy. There were always disagreements, always underlying friction, but it remained within a controlled framework. What we are witnessing now is something fundamentally different. It is the shift from controlled rivalry to the edge of direct confrontation. And this shift is not just political, it is psychological. Nations, much like individuals, operate on perception. When lines are crossed, when actions move from symbolic to physical, the entire mindset changes. A missile is not just a weapon, it is a message. A drone is not just surveillance, it is a statement. It says, we are no longer speaking through intermediaries, we are speaking directly.
This is where the danger lies.
Because once communication becomes physical rather than diplomatic, the room for misunderstanding increases dramatically. And history teaches us that wars rarely begin with clear intentions of full-scale conflict. They begin with small escalations, miscalculations, reactions to reactions. One side believes it is sending a warning, the other interprets it as an act of war. And suddenly, both sides find themselves locked in a cycle they never fully intended to enter. Think about the transformation taking place here. The UAE has long positioned itself as a hub of stability, economic growth, global connectivity, a bridge between East and West. It has invested heavily in projecting an image of neutrality and progress. But when it becomes a direct target, that identity is challenged. It is forced to transition from a nation of diplomacy to a nation of defense. And that shift carries consequences, not just militarily, but ideologically.
Because once a country begins to think in terms of survival rather than cooperation, its decisions change. Its alliances harden. Its tolerance decreases. Its responses become sharper, faster, and sometimes more aggressive. And on the other side, Iran operates with its own framework, a mix of strategic depth, regional influence, and a long-standing narrative of resistance. From its perspective, these actions are not random. They are calculated moves within a broader vision. So what we have now is not just two countries reacting to each other. We have two worldviews, two strategic philosophies, beginning to collide more openly. And when worldviews collide, the conflict becomes harder to contain. It's no longer about a single incident. It becomes about identity, influence, and long-term positioning. This is why we must pay attention to the language being used, the tone of responses, the speed of escalation. These are not small details. They are indicators of a larger shift. The moment diplomacy becomes secondary to demonstration of power, we enter a new phase. A phase where every action carries heavier consequences and every silence becomes more dangerous. And yet, there is still a window, a narrow one, but it exists. A window where restraint can still override reaction, where strategy can still overcome emotion. Because once that window closes, history shows us how difficult it is to reopen. So the real question is not just what is happening, but how we understand it. Are we seeing isolated events, or are we recognizing the pattern forming before our eyes? Because if this truly is the transition from tension to confrontation, then we are not just witnessing a moment. We are witnessing the beginning of something far more consequential. And the reality we must reflect on is this.
Conflicts do not suddenly explode. They slowly evolve, until one day, it's too late to turn back. To understand why the UAE finds itself in this position, we have to move beyond the surface-level explanation that it is simply caught in the middle. No, nations are rarely targeted without reason. In geopolitics, every move carries intent, and every target carries meaning. The UAE, in many ways, represents far more than its physical borders. It symbolizes influence, connectivity, and alignment in a rapidly shifting global order. Think about what the UAE has become over the past few decades. It is not just a country, it is a hub of trade, finance, diplomacy, and global movement. Cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi are not merely urban centers, they are gateways linking continents, economies, and ideologies. This kind of position brings power, but it also brings vulnerability. Because when you become central to the system, you also become a pressure point within it.
From Iran's perspective, targeting or pressuring the UAE is not random aggression. It is strategic signaling. It is a way of communicating beyond the UAE itself. It sends a broader message to allies, to partners, and even to global powers that operate within or through the region. The message is subtle, but powerful. Influence has a cost, and alignment has consequences. This is where the psychological dimension becomes crucial. In any conflict, there is always an attempt to shape perception. It is not just about damaging infrastructure or demonstrating military capability. It is about altering the calculations of your opponent. If you can make a nation feel exposed, uncertain, or vulnerable, you begin to influence its decisions without needing constant escalation. Pressure, in this sense, becomes a tool more effective than outright war.
But here's the deeper layer that we often overlook. When a country like the UAE is targeted, it is not just responding to a single actor. It is responding to the implications of what that targeting represents. It must ask itself difficult questions. How secure are our alliances? How resilient is our position? How far are we willing to go to protect what we have built? And these questions do not remain confined to policymakers. They ripple outward, into markets, into public sentiment, into the broader regional atmosphere. Stability, once shaken even slightly, creates a chain reaction. Investors hesitate. Allies reassess. Populations become more aware, more alert, sometimes more anxious. This is how pressure multiplies without a single additional strike. At the same time, Iran operates within its own strategic logic. It understands that direct confrontation with larger coalitions carries risk. So instead, it leverages influence asymmetrically, applying pressure where it can create maximum effect with calculated moves. The UAE, due to its global integration, becomes an ideal node for such pressure. It is visible, connected, and impactful. What we are witnessing, then, is not just a conflict between two nations. It is a contest over influence, over narrative, over who gets to shape the future direction of the region. And in such contests, symbolism matters just as much as strategy. So when we ask, why the UAE? The answer is not found in a single event. It is found in what the UAE represents, and in how that representation fits into a much larger geopolitical equation. And the reflection we must take from this is simple yet profound. In a world of power and perception, the strongest positions are often the most tested, because they matter the most. If we step back from the immediate headlines and look at the deeper structure of this conflict, we begin to realize that the true battlefield may not be where the missiles land, but where the world's lifelines flow. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water, yet one of the most strategically critical on the entire planet. This is not just geography, this is leverage. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes through this corridor. Tankers move through it daily, carrying energy that fuels entire economies, from Asia to Europe and beyond. Now think about that for a moment. When a single location holds that much significance, it doesn't just become important, it becomes powerful. And with power comes the ability to influence far beyond your immediate surroundings. For Iran,
The strait is not merely a waterway. It is a strategic asset, a form of indirect control over the global system. It doesn't need to shut it down completely to make its presence felt. Even the threat of disruption is enough to send shockwaves through markets, to raise oil prices, to create uncertainty across continents. This is what we call psychological dominance, where the fear of action can be as impactful as the action itself. And for the UAE, along with other Gulf states, this reality creates a constant tension. Because their prosperity, their stability, and their global relevance are deeply tied to the uninterrupted flow of trade through this very route. Any instability here is not a distant concern. It is immediate, tangible, and deeply personal. It affects not just governments, but entire economic ecosystems. So now the conflict expands. It is no longer confined to direct exchanges or targeted strikes. It moves into a domain where global interests are automatically involved. Because the moment the flow of energy is threatened, the world cannot remain neutral. Major powers begin to pay closer attention. Alliances start to activate. What was once a regional issue begins to take on global dimensions. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex. Control over such a critical nukta does not always require physical domination. Sometimes it requires unpredictability. If a nation can create a perception that it might act, that it could escalate, that it is willing to take risks others avoid, then it gains an upper hand without firing a single shot. This is the psychology of deterrence, but also the psychology of calculated uncertainty. And this is what makes the current moment so fragile. Because when one side leverages uncertainty, the other side feels compelled to restore certainty. And how do you restore certainty in such a situation? Often through shows of al-quwwa, military presence, international coalitions, strategic deployments. But every show of strength, no matter how defensive it claims to be, is perceived by the other side as a khutwa closer to escalation. So we find ourselves in a cycle. Threat leads to response. Response leads to counter-response. And all of it revolves around a narrow stretch of water that has now become a symbol of something much larger. The intersection of al-iqtisad, al-siyasa, and al-quwwa. And this is why we must understand that conflicts like these are rarely about a single al-hadaf. They are about control over systems, systems that sustain the modern world. When those systems are threatened, the stakes rise dramatically, and the margin for error becomes dangerously thin. So as we reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, are we merely observing a regional tension, or are we witnessing the early signs of a global ad-daghat point being tested? Because the truth is this: when the al-alam's most critical lifelines become adawat in a conflict, the consequences are never contained. They ripple outward, affecting everyone, everywhere. And the lesson we must take is clear. The most dangerous battles are not always fought on land. They are fought over control of what the world cannot live without. As we bring all of these threads together, the escalation of tension, the strategic targeting of influence, and the silent power of critical global roots, we arrive at a moment that is perhaps the most defining of all: the choice between war and restraint. And this choice is rarely as simple as it appears on the surface, because from the outside, it may seem like a straightforward equation. One side acts, the other responds. One khutwa leads to another. But in reality, every decision made at this level carries layers of calculation: political, al-askari, and even psychological. Leaders are not just thinking about the next move. They are thinking about the consequences of that move 5, 10 steps ahead. And yet, despite all this planning, history shows us something deeply ironic. Even the most calculated conflicts can spiral beyond control. The UAE, for example, finds itself in a position where it must balance two competing priorities. On one hand, it cannot afford to appear weak.
In geopolitics, perceived weakness invites further pressure. On the other hand, it cannot afford to overreact, because overreaction risks triggering a broader confrontation, one that could pull in regional and global powers, transforming a contained situation into something far more dangerous. This is the paradox of power. Strength must be demonstrated, but restraint must be maintained. And navigating this balance requires a mustawa of discipline that goes beyond military capability. It requires strategic patience, clarity of vision, and an understanding of long-term consequences. On the other side, Iran operates within its own framework of resistance and influence. It understands that escalation is a tool, but also a risk. It pushes boundaries, but often stops just short of crossing certain lines, at least initially. This creates a constant state of tension, where both sides are testing limits without fully committing to all-out conflict. It is a dangerous game because the margin for error is incredibly small. And this is where the human element becomes critical. Behind every policy, every strike, every response, there are individuals making decisions under pressure. Decisions influenced not just by logic, but by perception, by pride, by fear, and sometimes by miscalculation. And when emotions enter a space that demands precision, the of unintended escalation increases dramatically. We have seen this pattern before in history. Conflicts that no one intended to expand suddenly did. Situations that could have been contained slipped beyond control. Not because leaders wanted chaos, but because the silsila of actions and reactions created a momentum that became difficult to stop. So the question we must ask is not simply, will there be war? The deeper question is, do the conditions for war already exist? And if they do, then what role does restraint play in preventing the inevitable? Because restraint is often misunderstood as weakness. In reality, it is one of the most difficult forms of strength. It requires the ability to absorb pressure without immediate retaliation. It requires confidence in long-term strategy over short-term satisfaction. And most importantly, it requires an awareness that not every provocation demands a response. But here lies the challenge. Restraint only works when both sides, at some level, recognize its value. If one side continues to escalate while the other holds back, the balance begins to shift, and eventually, the pressure becomes too great to ignore. This is why the current moment is so critical. It is not just about what has happened. It is about what happens next. Every decision from this point forward carries amplified consequences. Every khatwa either opens the door to de-escalation or pushes it further closed. And for the rest of the world, this is not a distant issue. Because as we have already seen, the implications extend far beyond borders. Iqtisad, energy, global stability, all of it is interconnected. When one region moves toward instability, the effects ripple outward in ways that few can fully control. So as we reflect on all of this, we must move beyond passive observation. We must begin to understand the patterns, the pressures, and the principles at play. Because awareness is the first step toward meaningful insight. And insight is what allows us to respond wisely, both as individuals and as part of a global mujtama. And the final reality we must confront is this. History does not just remember the moments when conflicts began. It remembers the moments when they could have been prevented, but weren't.